This song sure should minister to your heart as the N1 Accord Quartet sings, "We Want America Back."
Something is wrong with America. She once held the Bible as her conscience and guide. We've allowed those who hold nothing to be sacred, like Sodom of old, to push morals aside. Where are the men who once stood for right, and the women who championed their cause? We must return to the values we've left before this nation we love is totally lost. We want America back. We want America back from those who have no self-control. We want America back.
Well, we're back on the pod again. Welcome to what has become the nightcap edition to the first ever, well, not first ever, but rarely occurring remotely Presbycast doubleheader days. For those of you who are doing this live or who are choosing to imbibe this episode and our previous one, they are both recorded within the same 24-hour period. Yeah, you know, it feels like I haven't left this seat all day. This technically makes me a hero and a frontline warrior. So we're glad that we can be here with you.
And a COVID survivor.
And as a COVID survivor, I am still waiting to hear what color we will wear to represent this, and also which month will be known forever as the month that will raise awareness about the existence of COVID-19.
Well, you're always in our hearts, so every month is Presby month.
It is
in the Presby verse. So, well, we do have another show, and we've got a repeat guest. You know, I think our friend Daryl Hart noticed this the other day that our guest was on a show a year or two ago, and it was entitled Miles Smith, High Church Presbyterian, and he's gotten so high that he's in the Anglican orbit, the Anglosphere, and well, there he is. So you're up there in the New Jerusalem, Hillsdale, Michigan, and how are things?
It's warm. It was almost 70 degrees today, so I walked outside. There's no snow left, so there's warmth in our hearts, and hopefully in our grading for our students. We're about to go on break, so they'll be happy to have us in good moods as we turn in their papers. But yeah, we've got good weather here. So in Michigan in March, that's about all you can ask for, because it can do just about anything this month.
So you are a visiting professor in history at Hillsdale?
Yeah, I teach classes on the kind of what's called the long 19th century. So I do pretty much anything from 1800 to 1860. So I teach the class on Thomas Jefferson, on Jackson, and the Civil War. So kind of the broad swath of 19th century history. So if it happened before before the progressives, I do it. So,
well, it's nothing complicated, difficult, or challenging there. Just pretty much a cream puff period.
It is, yeah. It's easy to teach. It's a lot of fun, and the students don't typically know too much about it. And also, they rarely have a professor from the South, so that makes it a little bit more fun for them to get a little cultural infusion from the dirty South every once in a while. So
Oh, can they tell you're from the South, or do you have to tell them?
they usually can tell if I start talking. I have a couple vocal quirks they pick up on, so they can figure it out pretty quickly. I don't sound like I'm from the Midwest, so.
Well, that's a blessing. Some of the I'm sorry, I don't want to offend anyone, but some of the worst accents I've ever heard are from that line that Wisconsin to Michigan to Northern Ohio. It's rough.
It's pretty pronounced, yeah. You and they don't eat spicy food. That's the other thing you can kind of tell. So they don't love. I actually have to travel with hot sauce to some restaurants. They won't.
Well,
have
Hillary Clinton does that, so you're in good company.
so.
You've forgotten that, hadn't you?
I think I didn't know that, so I might stop doing it now. So.
Now, it was said that
it was a statement that was definitely not a pander in any way
right.
to anyone at all. It was a completely legitimate thing that she just does because she just loves her spicy food and would never pander to anyone ever at all.
Just randomly carrying around sriracha or Frank's and I'm from North Carolina, so Texas Pete is our go-to hot sauce. So.
Well, maybe all that hot sauce is the reason that she ain't no ways tired. I think that's. I heard her say that one time. Well, so with your historical perspective, you can. I think I've seen you remind people that. It's been this bad. It's been as bad as this before and worse. What does, as we get started, what does a historian make of 2021 or 2020? Compared to, previous decades and centuries of American history.
Yeah, I think I teach. So I do. This time of year, we are starting the Civil War in our class. We call it here sectionalism.
I was told one was already starting right now.
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
So it's one of the things that social media has done is there's this real sense of sensationalism. I see people talk a lot about how tired they are. I'm just tired of this. And it's usually young people my age. I'm 37, my age or younger. And they're kind of having some sort of sentimentalist, kind of emotive sort of, oh, I'm so tired. And the fact of the matter is it's actually been pretty easy on people my age. We're all relatively healthy. We've weathered whatever this pandemic has been pretty well. And so I think you've seen it just kind of become a way of people sort of outletting whatever socio-emotional angst they have by saying we're tired. It's not that bad. Most of us have food on the tables, roofs over our heads. We can still worship. I'm not saying it's good, but I'm certainly not saying it's apocalyptic either. So,
well, some people can't afford the latest iPhone, though.
Yeah, I can't afford the latest iPhone. I think it's the 12 now, right?
My son is staying here tonight, and he had trouble logging into his NBA season pass, and it was a crisis. So things are not as good as you say they are.
I you know what I don't have my MLB pass anymore, so I can't watch my much beloved Washington Nationals right now.
Was that Washington Nationalist? Is that what you said?
Yeah, that's right. They're going to rename the team. So
they're actually just going to play on the National Mall since they're already building the fencing to be permanent. We'd like to thank Joe Biden's Infrastructure Week.
They should put.
That's not commentary. He's just the president right now. Okay, If it was someone else, I would say their name. Okay.
They should put the feet on the fence from the Oval Office, just kind of like they do on the fences, and in the parks.
I liked it. Was it the Joe Biden staring out the window meme and just kids playing baseball in the yard? I'm gonna put my German Shepherd out there and get these kids off my yard.
Rounding first and headed towards the Supreme Court building to check up at second. Yeah.
Let's just be thankful that Joe's dog didn't eat a child, because it had to go home.
Yeah.
It had issues. Maybe things are worse than ever.
Yeah,
Um,
the restaurants downtown DC haven't opened. I think that Maryland just opened up, and so I'm sure the mayor of Washington will be forced to kind of her hand will be forced soon enough because everybody's going to drive out the Chevy Chase or Bethesda to eat at restaurants, and downtown DC will become even more of a restaurant hellhole than it already is. So,
Well, what was it? It was like someone. I think it was former Presbycast guest Ken Shepard was talking about the city of Baltimore. Basically, the mayor saying that they would not be opening the city at the rate Governor Cooper or Governor Freudian slip Governor Hogan had sort of like pushed or recommended. And I understand that we make fun of Harry Potter people for reading, read another book. But it really wasn't hard to see how that could have been like the Wire season Pandemic.
right.
Is, Mayor Carcetti just trying to like slow down, don't open it up so I can, and then just planning how he can look better as a result of saving the city.
Prop joke cornering the market on the vaccine to distribute to West Baltimore. That's season 6 that we need. So
Could you? Oh,
I got that pandemic. One of the drugs they were slinging was called the pandemic. So yeah.
and it is so hard to find a clear sound clip of that. I have looked high and low because we should have been playing it since last March.
Yeah.
Because today is officially, this is March 11th. This is officially 1 year since the reliable World Health Organization declared that it was a pandemic.
Oh, okay.
Which many of you will also remember as the day which allowed liability lawyers to cancel everything and get their deposits back. So, yeah.
All right. Well, Miles, you're not just a national bon vivant and educator. You are a published author, published in respected online journals at least. You have written a piece called let's bring it up there. Would that it were really Christian nationalism. This was an article you wrote for the American Conservative. And I think you were telling me earlier that not everyone understood where you were coming from or your motivation. But let's just talk about the genesis of the piece and then work through it because I think it'll be interesting to our listeners. So, why would you write an article entitled "Would that it really were Christian nationalism"?
That's a great question. Why I did it was like I'm on Twitter and I hear my students talking, and my students are pretty intuitive people, and so there was this online polemic that that the election of Trump, and by the way, I wasn't a Trump voter in either 2016 or 2020, but that this was Christian nationalism. You kept hearing this, that the Trump support was Christian nationalism, and that Christian nationalism was heretical and that kind of needed to be expunged from the Christian body politic. I have in the piece, my opening paragraph is a little bit spicier. I sort of say, was it, the hitherto untainted American body politic, as if we've never dealt with Christian nationalism before, and there's just in the last 4 years or whatnot that it's happened. So what I sort of realized and what I felt was going on was that Christian nationalism was a term that was being applied to a certain type of American folk religion to kind of paint it with this sort of theocratic, Margaret Atwood, Handmaid's Tale stripe. And so basically what I kind of realized is this term was being used for partisan political reasons. And you were seeing increasingly that anything that was supported by conservative politicians was being labeled Christian nationalism. And so I wanted to push back against it for a couple reasons. One, I don't think that sort of partisan that sort of use of the rhetoric for partisan reasons is fair at all. Two, I am a Christian. I'm a relatively catechized Christian, and so I don't think that sort of a folk oneness Pentecostalism needs to be basically held up as what is properly Christian or improperly Christian, even. And three, I'm a confessing Anglican, and I grew up in a Presbyterian church. The roots of those churches, whether that you agree with it or not, the roots of those churches, the reformers, all would have understood themselves on some level to be what we call Christian nationalism. They were establishmentarians who, for better or worse, believed that state churches were appropriate. And so to call Christian nationalism heretical, I think is to slander the men who are the cornerstones of my faith. John Calvin, Thomas Cranmer, Martin Luther, men like that. And you could add Philip Melanchthon. You could add even Catholics can be Christian nationalists. Chateaubriand is an example. Donoso Cortez, who I mentioned in there. So what I'm not willing to do is let especially American Baptists establish the terms for what is properly heretical and not heretical when it comes to the relationship between the church, the state, and the civil order. You can disagree with the reformers, but calling Christian nationalism heretical is dangerously close to a sort of en masse deconstructionist polemic where you end up basically saying anybody who doesn't believe what Thomas Jefferson and the Virginia Baptists believed is a heretic.
Well, this was I loved your first paragraph because it was sort of one of those like great ironies that a lot of Baptists, but I think people waste a lot of time and breath getting angry about things Russell Moore says, like for better or worse, because I think it's misdirected. Is like, okay, you can be angry. You know, Russell Moore says he doesn't like the Popeyes chicken sandwich. Well, everyone's gonna, get angry one way or the other about that. But really, it's like if you're more angry about what he's saying than the fact that, like you said, a church wedded to separating religion from the civil order has a bureaucratic apparatus for making sure its voice is heard in the Republic's councils. You're barking up clearly the wrong tree. And I remember when I realized this, it was sort of like one of those justification by faith alone moments. Is I don't have to be angry about him anymore. I'm free from it. Instead, I can be angry against an inanimate concept in office, and who can blame anyone for raging against that?
Well, and before the ERLC, I forget what it used to be called. It was called something else. Richard Bland was the head, and he may as well have worked for the Republican Party. He was a consistent supporter of anything the Bushes or Reagan, and he was there a long time. I remember I was a Baptist until 2003, so I got those. And Russell Moore was a major correspondent for the for Baptist Press back in the 90s. So when I got the Tennessee Baptist newspaper called the Reflector, there was always a Russell Moore piece in there. So he certainly changed that agency, but it's still sort of a virtue signaling lobbying group, and they all become irritating at some point. One line I wanted to comment on. It says increasingly polluting the hitherto untainted ? American body politic. What we tend to forget about the so-called insurrection, it was the House of Representatives, which I would say probably operates on the ethics of a brothel most of the time.
And that's an insult to brothels.
It's pay to play.
I mean, they have really impressive bookkeeping operations. I mean, we should give credit to them for keeping track of where the money is.
Yeah, I bet they don't spend more than they have. But go ahead.
Well, I think so much of this, you mentioned the ERLC. I'm sure there's great people there, very earnest people there, but I think, and again, this is why I wrote the piece, is that we have a lot of presumptions about church and separation of church and state, and that people can debate that till the cows come home. But it's pretty clear that no one really believes it to the point of complete separation. No one actually agrees with Jefferson, because if you did, you would be Thomas Jefferson, and no one's really willing to be him. There's a lot of good things to be said for disestablishment. There's a lot of good things to be said for separation of church and state, but the sort of Baptist tell-us about it is a sort of quietism where the establishment becomes the demos, and by that I mean the Greek word the people. I don't necessarily want to put religion in the people any more than I want to do the state. And so I think what I'd like to do is not necessarily take a position, but at least ask people, especially magisterial Protestants, Presbyterians, Lutherans, Anglicans, to conceive of maybe viewing their tradition as older and not necessarily nailed to the predispositions of low church American evangelicals in 2021.
Yeah, and the Christian nationalist shibboleth is pretty much it's just used as a club against people that you don't like. I mean, I think that's pretty clear. And I think that's your point, that it's not really fair, and it's not precise, and it's not really historically situated.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, when you have, people saying the Trump shaman is a Christian nationalist, well, the word's worthless. I think that guy is some sort of pantheist, right? And so I think you just see, what you just said, Charles. It's become this kind of shtick that people use to assign a sort of boogeyman identity to a wide variety of things that they just don't like. So it's become this kind of exclusionary term that doesn't actually mean anything.
Sort of like evangelical.
Yeah, very similar.
Yeah. So anyway, yeah, it's amazing how quickly. Well, it's like we all know how the term white supremacy or white supremacist was converted in 2015 or 16, just in a matter of no time. A term that would only apply previously to skinheads and Nazis was being applied to many Americans and most institutions, including religious institutions and bodies. In the same way, it seems like all the kind of with it, kinder, gentler, progressive evangelicals decided in the last 6 months that this was all Christian nationalism, and it's a heresy and it has to go. So the first sentence of your second paragraph, you say, I'm not ready to call Christian nationalism heresy, and I'm not convinced that what was represented at the Capitol on January 6, 2021, was a meaningful example of the historical or traditional set of intellectual, political, or social presumptions associated with Christian nationalism. So, not a heresy and not a good definition.
Yeah, and I think the reason why a book that I think is kind of a great explanation of some of the terms that I'm wanting to invoke is Yoram Hazany's book on nationalism. Yoram Hazany is a conservative Orthodox Jew, and he's written quite a bit on the idea of nationalism. His book was really well received, but also made a bunch of people angry because he was sort of saying, well, of course I'm a nationalist. I'm a Christian, or excuse me, a Jewish person who's affirms a Judeo-Christian social order based on, according to him, certain Protestant fundamentals that give us sort of local national freedoms instead of living under this sort of, integralist Catholic, global order. So I think that the reason I don't want to call it heresy is not because I'm particularly enthused about it. I'm not a particularly political person. I'm a conservative person, and I vote, but I'm not a person who gets. I had a argument with someone on campus the other day. I'm not someone who really enjoys activism. I don't think it's particularly important to my faith. So that qualifier, the reason why I don't want to call it heresy is because there's, especially in 2021 United States, we have a tendency to deconstruct, especially historic Protestantism. We just don't like the history of Protestant faith. And so we've kind of shorn it away slowly and surely, things that we don't like about it. So now that all we've arrived at is some sort of broad, gospel coalition, Kellerite, sort of Baptisterian kind of faith, right? This is only what is acceptable to a lot of quote unquote evangelicals, and I think that's relatively shallow. I think there's a lot meatier things about the Protestant faith, my own Anglican expression, for the Reformed, for Lutherans. And so I just am not willing to anathematize the Reformers, which I think if you concede the idea that Christian nationalism is heretical, you get dangerously close to doing.
Well, and I guess about the only case you can make is that it's idolatrous, but it doesn't touch on the person of Christ or the way of salvation. I don't think most. I mean, the opening number we heard. I mean, it's tacky, and it's dumb, and it's maudlin, and it's kind of phony, but it's not heretical. So,
right. A great question I ask my students is this: you played thing. I think one of the problems in the United States is we have a tendency to view fundamentalist Christianity as sort of a baseline of what is Christian. And that's because especially a certain type of Reformed Christian or Baptist exists. And this is really prevalent in evangelical or even post-evangelical circles, exists downstream from what we call the fundamentalist liberal controversy. I think the problem with that is we frame Christianity outside of history if we do that. There's been plenty of other conversations about these things that have nothing to do with fundamentalists or evangelicals or low church Christianity. Protestants have been talking about this for hundreds of years. And if we sort of baptize our Americanist presumptions about it, the conversation will never go very far, because we'll always be left with basically having to choose between our American options. And because I'm not particularly patriotic, I don't feel like I need to basically choose what is religious Americanism, is what I want to call it, a sort of Protestant Americanism. The popes at the end of the 19th century basically said you can't affirm like what they called Catholic Americanism as the true faith, and we shouldn't affirm our Protestant Americanism as the true faith either. So I want to have bigger terms. I want to have a bigger understanding of what the faith is outside of just mere American low church evangelicalism.
Well, let's talk about what the real examples of Christian nationalism we've seen in America. I would say, apart from, I don't think we had that, I don't think a lot of people at the time of the Revolution in the early 19th century that people really had this messianic city on a hill complex to the degree that we might think. But I'm sure there was some associated with the Civil War. We hear the Battle Hymn of the Republic and things like that. But that's almost understandable in an existential struggle as the Civil War was.
Well, what you find is different regions. I think this is what's interesting. There's never been an American version of it, because different regions and different historical groups understood it totally differently. New England has this really strong kind of congregationalist version of it. In the South, there's sort of this, you could call it resentful sort of high church Anglican version of it. A guy like William Lynn who is a New York Presbyterian, has sort of an American Presbyterian version of it. So one of the problems is treating it as just this unitary, this kind of one size fits all understanding. There's been there's been a lot of American Christian nationalism, but none of them really exist as we understand it, or as they understood it. Excuse me. None of those exist really today.
Yeah, we were far less monocultural in the
Right.
19th century than we are today. But the real examples of Christian nationalism, if you want to find them, were in what I called late stage Finneyism, with the progressives and the do-gooders, and then we see it all around the First World War. And you could say Woodrow Wilson was a Christian nationalist, much more so than Donald Trump, I would say.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the progressives are, of course, Christian nationalism. They conceive of themselves as adopting that language and that institutional commitment to make America more moral, make America more Christian. So the real problem is that Christian nationalism has been typically progressive in the United States, not what we would call conservative or populist at all. I taught the Battle Hymn of the Republic today, and I always have my students read the Battle Hymn of the Republic, and then I have them read Mark Twain's Battle Hymn Updated, which if you've never read, you definitely should. It's just amazingly effective slander of the Battle Hymn. Those are people with progressive dispositions. That typically in the United States is where you see it. There is a conservative version of it in New England with people like Theodore and Timothy Dwight, but that goes away by 1830. So once the state churches are gone, that kind of conservative Christian nationalism is really gone forever in the United States, and it hasn't really been brought back ever since.
So that's something that people forget. But it occurs to me, I think we talked about a little of this before the show. I think some evangelicals have sort of, maybe they've turned their back on the idea of Christian nationalism in favor of advocating for, some very large cities that we could almost conceive of as a city-state. I'm thinking of New York City.
Yeah, it's baptizing. Well, no, I think you're right in one sense. I mean, you're baptizing, you're kind of sacralizing a city. A Catholic priest in the early 20th century, Father Vincent McNabb, wrote actually a book and a series of pamphlets pushing back against the baptizing of urban ministry. And he considered himself a distributist, which is this kind of if you know anything about distributism, a sort of an anti-capitalist but also anti-socialist kind of third way of looking at the world. But he pushed against that precisely because he thought that if you baptize cities, you got kind of a new type of nationalism. And he was very Catholic, of course, so he thought that basically what you do is you turn urban ministry into a sacrament. And he obviously was a priest and took the sacraments very seriously, and so he pushed against that. And you haven't seen quite the push against it in Protestant circles, I think, because, we quote unquote lost cities for a generation, and we want to get them back. I think people are kind of figuring out that maybe making that a commitment wasn't the best use of our intellectual energies.
You refer to folk religion being mistaken for Christian nationalism. I think I know what you mean, but explain that concept.
Yeah, so Christian nationalists historically have been really committed to institutions. They want to use institutions to Christianize their society, for better or worse. And so you have a state actors, ecclesiological actors, state institutions. So a real commitment on some level to institutions. What you don't have with Trump's sort of what I'm calling folk revivalists or folk Christians is a commitment to institutions. They're not committed at all to institutions. They're committed really either to him or to kind of this folk Christian ethic. And so it's really sort of a folk movement. It's not real Christian nationalism. None of these people are worried, like, say, John Calvin or Martin Luther, about getting a Christian interpretation of usury laws written in to the basic law of the United States. They're not worried about those things. They're almost strictly worried about symbolism, not about legislation. So that kind of commitment to symbology and not to institutions, I think, is really telling, because historically, on some level, Christian nationalists are trying to build a nation. And you can't build a nation just with symbols. You have to be committed to institutions.
It's funny you use that term folk religion because I guess while I was still a Baptist, I was coming out of it. And when I first became a Presbyterian, and of course I lived in a rural area. I identified what I called just kind of generic Southern folk religion, which means that at some point in your life you've had some connection to an evangelical church. You walked an aisle, you went to Bible school, you did something. You don't beat your wife, and you don't throw the beer cans in the yard. And if you hit those three markers, you're considered a pretty good old boy, and presumably are going to heaven. But I never considered folding a certain kind of Americanism into that definition, and really it did not. It didn't. The political party didn't matter because, as you know, in some counties in the South, even though everyone votes for Reagan, all the local officials are Democrat. And based on your job, if you're a miner or a government employee, you may vote Democrat anyway. So, people have an affinity for the flag and they like to say the Pledge of Allegiance, but it never occurred to me that was Christian nationalism. It was just folk religion.
Yeah.
So,
I think one of the things that's a great question I've asked this to my students, and my students are, like I said, they're sharp, and so they jump on this really well, is to ask them, would a person who's a sort of Trump Christian, and think in your mind of kind of the people who've been variously identified as court evangelicals by sort of centrist or liberal evangelicals, kind of this idea there's a court evangelical. And it's usually someone who's kind of a charismatic or Pentecostal person. You don't have a lot of, there's no PCA or even sort of highbrow SBC people on that list for the most part. There's Robert Jeffress. But think about, would any of them think John Calvin is a Christian? Ask yourself that question, because John Calvin doesn't hit some really important things for them. He doesn't.
Namely, he's not American.
Yeah, he's not American. He's French. He doesn't believe in the rapture, right? John Calvin's not a dispensationalist. John Calvin doesn't affirm a lot of things, especially when it comes to sexual ethics, that a lot of the folk religionists do.
He's a wine drinker.
Yeah,
he was paid in barrels of wine.
Yeah, he drinks wine. He baptizes babies. So there's a lot of things that your average sort of folk dispensationalist is going to hear about John Calvin. He's not a 6-day creationist. He's not, an evolutionist, but he's not going to sound on certain things like what they want him to sound like. And so is he even going to be considered a Christian to a lot of these folk revivalists? My students aren't convinced. And so I think that's a really important question. If these folks would look at Martin Luther and John Calvin and say, oh, I don't recognize their Christianity, why are we baptizing this group of people who aren't really church, aren't really catechized? Why are we letting them control the terms of what's Christian nationalism and not 400 some odd years of Protestant thought?
Well, there is some, you can understand to a degree why people like Southern Baptist Russell Moore, or maybe David French, who, as you told me, was a former Pentecostal. I didn't know that.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think he's from Kentucky, somewhere.
Okay.
I think he grew up charismatic or maybe Church of God. One of those kind of, I don't even know how you
All right.
describe those
Yeah.
groups.
So, but you could understand why they feel some responsibility for what they see as the failure of religion, which, I mean, that failure, apparently it was never apparent until 2016 and 2020, but it's all encapsulated in the 81% who voted for Trump. Apparently before that, there wasn't such a big problem.
Yeah, I
But
think that's a lot of it. I mean, this, and I'm sure David French is a wonderful guy, but I mean, this is really about politics, right? It's not about Christianity. You know, um, a professor, actually a progressive professor, but a smart guy who I really respect, made a point recently that 81% of evangelicals voted for George Bush. Somewhere on that same number voted for George Bush. So is this really about Christianity, or is it just about political realignment? And I tend to think it's the latter.
yeah, political realignments are uncomfortable, and when your team doesn't win, or when your team really embarrasses you, nobody deals well with that. Moving on through your article, let's see. Yeah, and so you do make the point that, and you've already mentioned this, Christian nationalism would include many people who we would respect. You know, Luther was very much, I mean, he had global impact, but he was very much about Germany. That was his focus. I just listened to Selderhaus's
Hmm.
biography of him, and I don't remember, I can't quote it, but his main concern was, and again, Germany was not as big, wasn't really a thing. You know, it was cut up into different kingdoms, or the Palatinate, and it just wasn't a unified thing like we think of now. It wasn't as big. So what he conceived of as Germany wasn't the size of present Germany. So his concern was fairly narrow. And of course, I think Calvin's main concern was Protestants in France. You made the point that he addressed, you know, the institutes to the emperor. He had to do that, I guess.
Yeah,
That was
to the King of France. Yeah, Francis
right.
the First.
Yeah, not the Holy Roman Emperor, although he that was a very confusing time, the way the loyalties shifted around. I mean, Luther dealt with that. Frederick the Elector lost a lot of. After they got what they wanted, Frederick the Elector lost a lot of Jews too. But
I think you're making a really important point. I don't think that we don't have to set up a state church. We don't have to replicate the reformers to be good confessional Protestants. I do think, though, that I saw J.D. Greer recently said something along the lines of, "We're not here to save America. We're here to save the world." It's something along those lines. And the fact, of course, is that, well, of course, you're here to save America. Like, why would you exclude your own country from your mission efforts, or why would you exclude your own country from your mission outreach, whatever that looks like for each different communion? I mean, the fact of the matter is that, of course, you're here to save America. You may save other countries too, but the notion that there's some sort of exclusionary reality that you can't have religion sort of affect your own country, and you can't even prioritize your own country. I think there's something really dubious about the intellectual construction that goes along with it. That the issue, of course, I think people get defensive about Christian nationalism. My question, I'd like to flip it around and say, well, why should we let Christian globalism have sort of a free pass? And so, I'm less worried about replicating Christian nationalism than I am kind of baptizing a sort of Francis Fukuyama, low church, some sort of Baptist Reformed edition, which tends to be, I think, the disposition among a lot of quote unquote evangelicals.
Well, this all feels like it feels like people that are sort of embarrassed about their parents,
Right.
or they come from a small town, and figuratively speaking, if you become a Washington columnist and you came out of a low church evangelical background, you're probably not going to continue to embrace it. You're going to turn on it, throw it under the bus, all of that.
Right.
But what
And yet, all of these people are not turning on their parents for listening to Bruce Springsteen or Fleetwood Mac, like things that they should rightly be downing their parents for.
Yes, the real killers, absolutely. But I remember when I was in high school, I was Southern Baptist, had never been anything else. Went to church with this girl I was dating, and I remember the pastor saying that we were in God's chosen nation, and this is in Arkansas now, and his chosen state, and his chosen city, and in his chosen church. He was trying to make the point that church, in that state, in that nation, in that city, was absolutely the most important thing in the world. I'll never forget that. But there was no, they weren't mobilizing and arming themselves to, and it was about evangelism, really. And, we can get evangelism and nationalism and the flag all mixed up. We know that. When I look at those idiots that Trump had in the White House, the court evangelicals, I mean, the question is, do you lose your mind about them, or do you think those are clowns and I would tend to, I never took them seriously, but I think what Moore and French and Tim Keller and some others, they want us to take it very seriously. And I think you're saying don't take seriously something that's so unserious.
Yeah, and I think the other thing too is there's a sort of indication that there's among certain evangelicals the sense that we have a right to possess a certain sort of influence in the councils of the state. So that traditionally has been sort of Republicans, right? Or at least in recent history. So a certain sort of, centrist evangelical has the right to have influence with a certain sort of Republican. And that's you could call that the George Bush model. Well, that's not there anymore. I think it's one of the things that I tell my students is that, here we are further away from Ronald Reagan's election than Ronald Reagan's election was from Pearl Harbor. So things change, and so do politics. And so I think this kind of customary relationship that a certain type of evangelicals been used to having with the political order is going to have to change. And I think that, again, that's what you're seeing go on. You're seeing this be really about political realignment and not necessarily about Christianity per se.
All right, so back to the not the court evangelicals, but the David French, Tim Keller, Russell Moore. What's the danger in them getting this wrong? Besides creating division and lopping off one whole segment of Christianity, I hesitate to say evangelicals because it's such a meaningless term. But why is it important to get this right?
So I think,
and to be careful with it.
So I think it's important because I remember I grew up Presbyterian, and I remember growing up liking the history of Presbyterianism. I still like it in the sense of I respect it. I think it's good. I think there's things that you should learn from Presbyterian history, and you shouldn't limit that to the 20th century. One of the strengths of the Anglican Communion is that they tend to like their history. Anglicans like their history. My question for a certain type of sort of reformed-ish evangelical is this. Do you like anything about the history of your communion with and you can't basically say soteriology. You have to think more than just soteriology. Do you like anything about what your historic communion has meant, what your history means? And I think ultimately, when you actually think about what's going on, is if you take Calvin and say, okay, he got just soteriology right, or maybe even just the regulated principle right, you've taken him and you pared him down so small that you can basically fit him into any given sort of suburban or urban environment, and he'll be kind of safe for America. I don't want John Calvin or Thomas Cranmer or Martin Luther to be safe for America. And so I think that doesn't mean you have to be crazy, but I think it does mean you have to recognize that these men are important. They're the foundation of Protestant churchmanship, and I don't want to shave them down so they can only fit inside my little 21st century American box.
Yeah, I mean, we shouldn't just take the parts that we find helpful, nor should we try to recreate Geneva or Wittenberg or, well, maybe even Knox's Scotland, as fun as it might be to use Knox level vitriol against our magistrates. And you also mentioned the charge of theocracy, the theocracy scare. I've not witnessed much theocracy in my lifetime or anything very close to it. But you mentioned a George W. Bush sparking a theocracy scare, and maybe that was probably because of some of the words he used in the prosecution of the Gulf War.
Yeah, I remember that. I was in college when the Iraq War started, and of course there was books. I mean, just a whole ream of books written that George W. Bush was some sort of theocrat, that he was bringing theocrats into the government, and how laughable, of course, that appears to us today in 2021, 17, 18 years later. But that was the scare. And so I think, obviously, George W. Bush isn't really a theocrat. And I think when we think of this word theocrat, we tend to think about Geneva or maybe Luther's Wittenberg, places like that, or Cranmer's England. One of the things that I think you could look at, and especially if you're in communion with a Napart church, is to read about the history of the Covenanters. These are quote unquote theocrats, who, I mean, you guys are in communion with. Now that doesn't mean that they're monsters, but also doesn't mean that you agree with everything they say. One of the things that I see my friend Ben Glaser is in the chat. My good friend from home, he's an ARP minister. And one of the things that he recommended me do, and this has been a few weeks back, was read the works of Alexander MacLeod. He was a Covenanter minister in the United States, and I commend his works to anybody. You don't have to agree with him about the Covenanter particulars, but when he talks about theocracy, he talks about it in a way that, for example, you're sort of you're not going to get anybody thinking that sounds like what I think of as theocracy, because all he says is basically that the Constitution, or whatever country's basic law is, has to affirm the lordship of Jesus Christ. That's it. They're by that definition, a lot of people would call them theocrats. They probably wouldn't call themselves theocrats, and I agree they're not really theocrats. But there's people who would say, okay, well, you have language of Jesus in your Constitution. Is that a theocracy? Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, consecrates the Constitution to the Holy Trinity and mentions Jesus in it. So is that theocracy? I don't know. Some people would say it is, right? Some people would say even the mere mention of that is theocracy. I'm not sure the RP would claim to be theocrats just because they think that the basic law needs to affirm the lordship of Jesus. So when we use these terms, we tend to have kind of prior assumptions about what they mean without necessarily thinking through, okay, does that actually fit what we think of when we mean theocrat?
All right, well, you wrap the article up by saying, I'm not going to wring my hands worried about Christian nationalism overtaking the United States. And if it ever did, I might not wring my hands at all. So I think you've sort of explained what that meant, but and I did note the comments under your article. Some of them were vitriolic, some of them were confused. Many of them yelled Trump or something like that. Some other one-syllable words. But explain what you mean by that. I think you mean that maybe these are not the droids that we're looking for.
Yeah, well, I think it's a little bit tongue in cheek. I mean, if a Christian nationalist movement were to basically push for, basically Calvin's understanding of say usury laws, if we curtailed banks' powers to just control people's finances, to control the finances of the poor, I don't think a lot of people would be upset about that. If you basically were to say, we don't want a foreign policy based on the en masse genocide of Arab Christians, I wouldn't be bothered by that. If that was a disposition, those aren't scary. Whether they happen or not, I don't think that should be a priority. Like I said, I'm not wringing my hands. This doesn't keep me up at night. I don't go to sleep worried that we don't have appropriate Christian nationalist dispositions in government. But I do think there's conceptions about the civil order that are important. I'm not a strict libertarian. And so I think once you sort of get to the fact that you're not a strict libertarian, you sort of have to ask, okay, well, what am I? Do I think that Christianity has a place in the civil order at all? And if so, to what extent? And so that's sort of left for people to work that out amongst themselves. I'm not going to offer them any answers. I'm giving them. I'm not getting out a program for them to work that out. But I do think it's worth asking. And I think the more important thing is, obviously, the modern Republican Party is not Christian nationalist at all. So
you mentioned libertarianism. Machen was at least a type, or was libertarian adjacent, but I believe it was him. I believe it was in Christianity and Liberalism. He said something to the effect that it's a poor man who does not love his country. In other words, is not patriotic to some degree, but it's also really bad to make an idol out of it. And I think what you're arguing for is something moderate and modest and middling when it comes to a nation with a lot of Christians in it, and still a lot of Christian influence, but maybe not now or ever was a Christian nation per se.
Yeah, and I think probably if you're asked my historian, but I don't know if the United States has ever been a quote unquote nation properly either. So that's another time. That's another debate for another time. But yeah, I think it's, on some level, it's simply not to concede terms so quickly, which evangelicals have a bad habit of doing. someone accuses them of being a Christian nationalist. Oh no, we're not that. In fact, to prove to you we're not that, we're gonna not worry about say on mass sexual revolution occurring in schools because if you worry about that, that's Christian nationalism. Well, no, that's not Christian nationalism. That's just maintaining a basic civil order.
Yeah, or a drag queen story hour, which our
Right.
friend David French was excoriated for not being as worried about it as he should have been. I don't know if that was fair, but I didn't find that to be interesting, and didn't follow that too much. Well, before we move on and talk a little bit of Anglican stuff, anything else on this issue?
Not that I can think of. I think it got enough. It got the wheels moving for enough people, and that was kind of what I wanted it to do, just to kind of get people thinking a little bit more, and really just about terms and how we're quick to concede some of them that maybe we shouldn't be so quick to concede. So,
All right. Well, you are an Anglican now, and that's even though you're right there at Hillsdale, you could have fallen under the sway of Daryl Hart and friends, but you're
I
strong.
fall under his sway enough socially. So, he's
Well,
a good cook. He's a good cook, so,
we all know how painful that can be.
he's a good cook and is a great host. So we all fall under his social sway without putting up much of a fight. So I'm thankful he's around.
So what I've learned from you is that Anglicanism, even just the part that is the ACNA in the U.S. is incredibly diverse. Different regions, or I don't know if you are they bishoprics or
Yeah, they're
I don't know.
dioceses, and so
Diocese. Okay, yeah.
every it's sort of like presbyteries. You can find presbyteries with vastly disparate beliefs in the PCA.
Well, we don't know what you're talking about there.
Yeah. Well, so I think all the Protestant churches right now, because of the kind of the moment we're in, even something as relatively unified as the LCMS has big divisions in it too. Although I think because they're close communion, I think they managed to circle the wagons a little bit better than certainly we Anglicans, and maybe even a little bit better than the PCA as well.
So one of the things that's come out in the last year or so, the PCA issued a report, and it's sort of a reaction to Revoice on human sexuality, and much more recently, the ACNA has issued a similar report, and I think it's inarguable that the ACNA report is a little bit to the right of the PCA report on things like the language gay Christian, or even SSA Christian, much more agnostic on terms and a little more open in some ways. But interestingly, just in the last couple of days, a notable Nigerian bishop, or archbishop. I mean, I'm not sure. He's the metropolitan, and he has 2 or 3 titles. But he sort of excoriated the ACNA report for being too open, for leaving the door open, even though the ACNA report condemned the term, or seemed to heavily caution against gay Christian language, even though it was much stronger than the PCA report on that in that way. This African bishop, who is a leader of GAFCON, which is the conservative global Anglicans, he didn't like the ACNA report. What did you make of all that, and what do you think? What are the currents in the ACNA? And you might also mention how you think they might be parallel or different than those in the PCA.
So I think that the ACNA is moving to the right. And I think what that just means is it's taking the Bible seriously on things that are debated in our cultural moment, sexuality, even race. It's probably been tampering down some of the language on some of the more excessive expressions of what is often called racial reconciliation. So the bishops are taking that seriously, and I think that's really good for the province. What Archbishop Kuba is, he's the primate of Nigeria, which means he's the senior archbishop in Nigeria, and they're definitely the largest province outside the Church of England, and they're undoubtedly the most conservative. And so they have a lot of weight to throw around. And I think some of this is the Archbishop of Nigeria basically saying, look, you guys aren't going to tell us what to do. We're going to tell you what to do. And maybe that's a good thing. The archbishops in Nigeria are powerful guys. They're used to persecution, and so they ride around with guards. And so this is
Are they Swiss guards?
they're not. They do have
young-
they have military protection.
Okay.
So,
They don't wear those funny pantaloons, and they have to be
No,
unmarried.
no, it doesn't look like the Swiss guards. Sometimes, in some of the northern dioceses, they're protected by Christian militias.
There's some Christian nationalism.
Yeah, it is. Obviously, the Africans have a different way of talking about it, but they don't necessarily see it as debatable like we do because we're Westerners and they're not. So I think what you're seeing is the fact that the ACNA is having to learn that it is 145,000 people in a global communion of 95 million people. And we don't get to set the terms anymore. And so we're being educated in humility, perhaps. And I think also it's just good to be reminded that there's a lot of things that we Westerners take for granted, and we think the majority of the world agrees with us when actually we're a minority position, especially when it comes to things like human sexuality. So I hope that our bishops will continue to make wise choices and to follow Scripture. And I think that's what's in most of their hearts. I think there's always a push for unity. You see in Western Christianity this desire for unity kind of at all costs. And I think there's a increasing tendency to maybe ask, at what price unity? And so we'll see what happens. And so certainly Archbishop Takuba is letting the North Americans know that he has an opinion, and not a very ambiguous one.
Well, let's try a concept on. It seems to me that the gay Christianity or the revoice doctrine, it seems to almost always occur in the context of white privilege. It's pretty obvious, and it seems to be at odds with global Bible believing Christians. So maybe it's even an expression of white supremacy.
Well, it's certainly Western. I think that's one thing that I think we all kind of know, but we don't say out loud, is that it's definitely Western. It's something that the West is kind of privileged on. We get to kind of have these conversations when in the rest of the world, especially in the developing world, it's not even negotiable. So it's certainly Western privilege. And in that sense, how long it lasts and what the end result will be is different. I'm a layperson, and so one of the great things about having prelates govern is that you don't have to wring your hands as much, and so certainly His Grace the Archbishop is going to do what he thinks is right for his province, which is 18 million baptized people, and I think probably on the order of 35 to 40 million who attend. And so, just to give you an example, that's about twice the size of the SBC.
Yeah, that's pretty big. Pretty big by any measure.
But does
Well,
he
so-
have a degree signed by Al Mohler?
I think I can speak authoritatively. He does not. I don't think he was educated in the United States. I think Archbishop Takuba is actually a Durham. He's an educated Durham, and actually, now that I think about it, he may have gone to Princeton. So he may have learned
no.
Presbyterians back in the day. So,
Well, it's interesting. We Presbyterians don't we don't have that we don't quite have that similar global thing where another Presbyterians on another continent outnumber us. Although that's coming. There are just tons of Presbyterians in Korea, and there are plenty of Presbyterians in Africa too. Although I think the more of them are associated with the liberal church. But it's been a few years since I thought about this. But I think the PCUSA had some problems with some of the African Presbyterian bodies they were affiliated with because, well, surprise, surprise, the PCUSA was far more liberal than they were.
yeah, I think last time I checked, there's more Presbyterians in Mexico than there are in the United States.
Yeah, that's right. No, that is true. So I remember hearing that as well. And again, each Presbyterian body is its own thing. There
Right.
are things we would consider to be, to the right of us or to the left of us. It's never going to look exactly the same. There are quite a few in India and Pakistan as well.
That's right. I think I heard that.
But they're unusual as well. There's a real range in belief and practice. So, and of course, who knows in China? I think soon.
Yeah.
There are a lot of Presbyterians in China in name, but for obvious reasons, they don't have a well-developed church structure. I mean, they just haven't been able to. So, yeah. In our lifetime, surely yours and Resby, since you all are very young, you'll experience more of this than I will. Well, anything else you want to get off your chest, or that you want to share with us?
Thanks for having me. I'm excited. I'm going to North Carolina tomorrow to get into to some nice weathers, even nicer weather. So I will be my much beloved hometown of Charlotte for the first time in a while. So I'll wave at Resby as I drive by where his neck of the woods.
Well, let me tell you who.
I won't tell you to DM and drive, but if you need a pit stop on the way back, just let me know.
Will do.
But let me tell you who cooks about as well as Dr. Daryl Hart, and that's Resby.
I've seen the pictures.
He is a foodie. You wouldn't think so, but about every other night I'm showing a picture to my wife on the phone and I'm saying, "Can you believe Resby did this? Look at this. This came out of his backyard, and it's pretty impressive."
Yeah,
anytime, guys.
They look great. They look absolutely great. So.
Well, all right. So you keep up with Miles online, IV Miles Smith.
But that's four, like the horseman.
Yeah.
Yes, IV. Yeah.
Notice the fingers. All right, you can't straighten those.
It's not some new COVID treatment. So, well, we hope everything goes well for you up there in Michigan and on your trip. And Resby will do what he does and tell everybody goodbye for the the second time today.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Yes,
Yeah.
sir.
Thank you, Miles, for coming on. As we move into the time of year that was really taken from us last year, and that, of course, is March Madness. We just like to acknowledge the fact that Duke won't be in the tournament. These things, above all else, must be celebrated. And thank you for listening to Presbycast. It's been a heck of a day, bookending the day, both the morning and now the late night with our show. So we hope that you will play this podcast as you go off to sleep tonight, that your family won't wake up too angry as they listen to this stirring spoken word. And above all else, please don't be an Erdman.
This nation is like a runaway train headed down the wrong track. It's time for the army of God to arise and say, we want America back. It's time for the army of God to arise and say, we want America back.
Now that's what I call a powerful song for the day in which we live.
Yes, and you know, they mentioned in that song that the Andy Griffith Show was the most popular show 30 years ago. Folks, I wish we had some good programs that we could watch as a family on TV nowadays, but you see sex and violence, and we do need to get back to the morals of our country.
Magic on the internet worldwide.